The order came fast. Deploy U.S. submarines toward Iran. In the early morning hours of February 28, 2026, U.S. forces launched strikes against Iranian military targets across the region. Missiles were fired, aircraft were airborne, and naval forces moved into position across the Middle East. But some of the most dangerous weapons in that operation weren't visible at all. Hundreds of feet below the surface of the Arabian Sea, U.S. nuclear submarines were already in place. Silent, hidden, waiting. These submarines are some of the most powerful strike platforms in the world. From underwater, they can launch Tomahawk cruise missiles that travel more than 1,000 kilometers before hitting their targets with precision. And during the first wave of strikes connected to the latest escalation with Iran, submarines were reportedly part of the strike network supporting U.S. naval forces already operating in the region. Then the strange part? These submarines may stay underwater for months at a time. A nuclear submarine does not need fuel like normal ships. Its nuclear reactor can power the boat for years. It can produce its own oxygen. It can make drinking water from seawater. So technically, it could stay underwater almost forever. Except for one very human problem: food. Because inside that steel hull are more than 130 sailors. Every single one of them needs to eat. Every day, sometimes for 3 months straight without seeing land. And that raises a question most people never even think about. If a submarine can stay hidden underwater during a real mission like the one near Iran, how does the crew actually get food? The answer is a mix of planning, creativity, and a lot of canned food. And it starts long before the sub ever leaves port. To understand how submarine crews get food during missions like the one near Iran, you first have to understand why these submarines stay underwater for so long in the first place. Modern U.S. attack submarines are powered by nuclear reactors. That single reactor gives the submarine something no other warship has: almost unlimited range underwater. A normal diesel submarine needs to surface regularly to recharge batteries. A nuclear submarine doesn't. It can stay underwater for months. The reactor produces enormous heat, which creates steam that turns turbines and drives the propeller. At the same time, the submarine generates electricity for everything on board: sonar, navigation systems, computers, and life support systems. Even the air the crew breathes is produced on board. Using a process called electrolysis, the submarine splits seawater into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen is pumped into the boat, while the carbon dioxide is removed using chemical scrubbers. Fresh drinking water is also made from seawater using onboard desalination systems. So from a technical point of view, the submarine is almost a self-contained underwater city. And during the current tensions with Iran, that capability is critical. U.S. subs operating around the Arabian Sea and the Strait of Hormuz have to remain hidden. Surfacing too often would make them easier to detect by satellites, patrol aircraft, or even Iranian naval forces operating in the region. So stealth is everything. A submarine that stays invisible can track enemy ships, gather intelligence, and, if needed, launch missiles without warning. But even a nuclear submarine with unlimited power still has one very real limit: the food on board. And that's why the real preparation for a 3-month patrol starts long before the submarine even leaves the dock. Long before a U.S. sub begins a mission like the one now unfolding around Iran, something unusual happens at the naval base. Food starts piling up. A lot of food. Because once a nuclear submarine leaves port, the crew may not see land again for 2 to 3 months. That means that everything the sailors will eat during the entire mission has to be loaded on board before the sub departs. And we're not talking just about a few crates here, because for a typical U.S. attack submarine with around 130 sailors, the crew will load tens of thousands of meals before deployment. The process usually begins just days before departure. Supply trucks arrive at the pier carrying pallets of frozen meat, vegetables, dry goods, canned goods, and long-lasting ingredients. And then the real challenge begins. Submarines were never designed with huge food storage areas. Space inside the hull is extremely limited, and every compartment already has equipment, weapons, or machinery. So the crew uses every available space. Freezers and refrigerators are filled first. After that, dry storage rooms are packed with boxes of pasta, rice, flour, cereal, and canned goods. But even that is still not enough. So the food spreads across the whole sub. Boxes are stacked in passageways. Crates are stored under bunks. Even the torpedo room, normally used to store weapons, is temporarily filled with food supplies. During the first few weeks of patrol, sailors sometimes joke that they're sleeping next to the grocery store. You might open a hatch and find it packed with potatoes, walk down a corridor and step over boxes of cereal. In some cases, sailors even have to move food crates just to reach their sleeping rack. But this crowded situation, of course, doesn't last forever. As the patrol continues, the crew slowly eats their way through the stored supplies. The piles of food disappear week by week, and the submarine gradually starts to feel more spacious again. Still, careful planning is essential, because if the food runs out early during a mission near Iran or anywhere else in the world, the submarine would have no choice but to return to port. And that's where one small group on board becomes incredibly important: the submarine cooks. Once the submarine leaves port, the responsibility for feeding more than 100 sailors falls on a surprisingly small team. On a typical U.S. nuclear submarine, the galley is run by just a few sailors known as culinary specialists. Their mission is simple on paper: feed the entire crew. In reality, it is one of the most demanding jobs on the submarine, because life on board never stops. Submarines operate on rotating watch schedules, meaning sailors are awake and working at all hours of the day and night. Some crews run on an 18-hour schedule instead of the normal 24-hour day. That means that the galley is almost always active. Cooks prepare 3 main meals every day, but food is often available almost constantly for sailors coming off watch. Someone finishing a 6-hour sonar shift at 3 in the morning still needs a hot meal. And all of this happens inside one of the smallest kitchens you can imagine. The submarine galley is compact, packed with ovens, grills, fryers, and storage lockers, squeezed into a tight steel compartment. When the submarine is fully loaded at the start of deployment, cooks sometimes even have to move food boxes around just to reach their equipment. But good food is more than just calories. It's morale. Life on a submarine during long missions, especially during tense operations like the current deployment near Iran, can be mentally exhausting. The crew works long hours in a confined space with no sunlight and very little privacy. So the cooks do everything they can to keep meals interesting. Early in the patrol, when fresh ingredients are still available, the menu might include things like steak nights, burgers, pizza, tacos, and fresh bread. These meals quickly become highlights of the day, because for the crew living deep underwater, a good meal is sometimes the closest thing they have to a normal life. But as the patrol continues, something starts to change. The fresh food slowly begins to disappear, and the menu on board starts to shift. During the first few days of a submarine patrol, the food on board can actually feel surprisingly normal. Fresh fruit is still available, eggs are real, not powdered, vegetables are crisp, bread is freshly baked in the galley. For a moment, life underwater feels almost comfortable. But everyone on board knows it won't last, because from the moment the submarine leaves port, the crew is slowly eating through a carefully planned timeline of food supplies. The first thing to disappear are always the fresh ingredients. Fresh fruit, lettuce, tomatoes, milk, and eggs usually last about 2 weeks, sometimes a little longer if they're carefully rationed. The cooks prioritize using these ingredients early while they're still good. After that, the menu begins to change. Frozen food becomes the backbone of the kitchen. Freezers packed before deployment contain large quantities of frozen meat, chicken, vegetables, and prepared meals. These supplies can last for several more weeks and allow the cooks time to keep serving familiar meals like burgers, pasta, or stir-fry. But even frozen food eventually runs low. By the later stages of a long patrol, often 6 to 8 weeks underwater, the galley relies heavily on long-lasting supplies. That means canned vegetables, powdered milk, dehydrated potatoes, pasta, rice, beans, and preserved meats. The cooks are trained to stretch these ingredients as far as possible. A single shipment of canned goods might need to support the crew for weeks. Menus become simpler, variety decreases, but the goal stays the same: keep the crew fed and focused. Because during real missions, like the one currently in operation surrounding Iran, submarines cannot simply surface whenever they want to restock. They are there to remain hidden, and that raises another question. If a submarine stays underwater for months during a real conflict, can it ever get resupplied with food at sea? In theory, yes. A submarine can receive new supplies during a mission, but in reality, it almost never happens, especially not during high-tension operations like the current U.S. deployment. The biggest advantage a submarine has is stealth. As long as it stays hidden underwater, it is almost impossible to track. The moment it surfaces or meets up with another ship, that advantage starts to disappear. And in places like the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Strait of Hormuz, surveillance is intense. Satellites constantly scan the ocean, patrol aircraft fly overhead, warships from multiple countries operate in the region. So arranging a resupply at sea becomes risky. Still, there are a few situations where it can happen. One method is a logistics rendezvous with a support ship. The submarine briefly surfaces, usually at night, and supplies are transferred across the water. This process is carefully coordinated and kept as short as possible. Another option is a port stop at an Allied naval base. U.S. submarines operating in the Middle East sometimes use facilities in places like Bahrain or other partner ports in the region. There, they can quickly restock food and supplies before returning to patrol. But during an active crisis or combat operations, commanders prefer submarines to stay hidden and avoid unnecessary movement. That means that most submarines begin their missions with every meal already on board, which is exactly why the food planning we talked about earlier is so critical. Because once a submarine disappears beneath the waves near Iran, it may not see another ship or another supply crate for months. And yet, despite being invisible most of the time, these submarines are still playing a major role in the conflict unfolding above the surface. While the crew is managing food supplies and daily life underwater, the submarine itself is focused on something far more serious: the mission. Since the escalation that began on February 28, 2026, U.S. naval forces have been heavily active across the Middle East. Carrier strike groups, destroyers, and aircraft have all been involved in operations targeting Iranian military infrastructure. But some of the most important platforms in that operation remain almost completely invisible, and that is the U.S. nuclear attack submarines. These submarines operate quietly in the deeper waters of the Arabian Sea and the northern Indian Ocean, just outside the most heavily monitored areas of the Persian Gulf. From there, they can track Iranian naval movements, monitor communications, and if necessary, strike targets hundreds of kilometers inland. Their main weapon for these missions is the Tomahawk cruise missile. A single submarine can carry dozens of them. When launched, the missile shoots out of a vertical launch tube, breaks the surface of the water, and ignites its engine in midair. From there, it flies at low altitude across terrain and coastlines, navigating with GPS and onboard guidance systems until it reaches its target. Because submarines are so difficult to detect, they're often used during the opening phases of military operations. A hidden submarine can launch missiles without warning and then disappear back beneath the ocean. And that is exactly why submarines remain deployed near Iran right now. They provide something every military commander values: a strike capability the enemy cannot easily see coming. But even the most advanced submarine on Earth still depends on something incredibly simple: 3 meals a day. And eventually, every patrol reaches the same moment, the moment when the food supplies finally begin to run out. For all the advanced technology inside a U.S. nuclear submarine, the truth is surprisingly simple. The submarine itself can operate for an incredibly long time. The nuclear reactor can run for years without refueling. The boat can produce its own oxygen. It can generate fresh drinking water from the ocean every single day. From a technical perspective, the submarine could stay underwater far longer than most people imagine, but the crew can't. Because no matter how advanced the submarine is, food is the one resource that cannot be created on board. Every meal has to be loaded before deployment, and every patrol slowly counts down those supplies. Steak nights disappear first. Fresh vegetables are gone within weeks. Frozen food lasts a bit longer. Eventually, though, the galley depends mostly on canned goods and stored ingredients. Until one day, the calculations become simple. Food remaining, crew on board, days left. And when those numbers stop working, the submarine finally turns for home. So while nuclear submarines may look like unstoppable machines, the truth is much simpler. No matter how powerful the reactor is, sooner or later, the food runs out. Now I'm curious about you. If you had to spend 3 months inside a submarine, what meal would you miss the most? Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe to help the channel reach 1,000 subscribers soon, and I'll see you in the next one.